The lantern swung on its rusty hook, casting shadows across the barn wall like demons in a church. Millie Harlan's back was pressed so hard against the rough wood she could feel splinters digging through her thin dress. Her breath came in ragged little gasps that burned her throat raw. Before her stood the cowboy, Eli Carter. He was tall as a mountain, and his shadow ate every last scrap of light in the small space. His hand was raised. And in that one, frozen second, every beating she'd ever taken came flooding back. It was a nightmare she lived with every day, but this time, she was sure she wouldn't wake up. "Please," she whispered, the word breaking into a dozen pieces. "Please don't beat me." The words just hung there in the dusty air, thin and useless as smoke. His hand stopped. It just stopped, hanging in the air where the violence was supposed to be. She flinched anyway. It was a reflex she couldn't control. Her arms flew up to shield her face, her whole body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. But the blow never landed. Those three little words, "Please don't beat me," had hit Eli Carter harder than any bullet ever could. It was the way she said it, like she'd whispered it 1,000 times before and never once been heard. Like begging was just a part of breathing, and mercy was a language she didn't speak anymore. Eli Carter had been a silent man since the day they put his wife, Mary, in the cold ground. He wrapped that silence around himself like a suit of armor. But now, watching this terrified woman cower before him, he realized his armor had become a weapon. And he hadn't even known he was swinging it. What happened in that barn would change both of them forever. But to understand why those words shattered a silent man's world, we have to go back 6 months. Back to a scorching summer day when they sold her for a single silver dollar. The year was 1886. The wind in Larkspur Crossing was a mean old thing, always trying to bury the town in dust. The sun was a white-hot hammer in the sky, beating down on the town square until every color surrendered. A dozen women stood under that cruel sky. Some were young, some were already worn down to nothing. All of them were desperate enough to stand barefoot on a wooden platform and be looked over like cattle. Among them was Millie Harlan. She was 28, but the weight on her shoulders made her look 40. Her shawl was pulled tight, and her eyes were fixed on the splintered boards beneath her feet, as if not looking would make her invisible. The auctioneer's voice was loud and tinny. He sounded like he was selling furniture, not people. "Next up, we got Millie Harlan," he barked, pointing at her like she was a stubborn mule. "Can sew, can cook, no family, no claims on her." The crowd shuffled. Dust puffed up from their boots. But no hands went up, not one. Millie's stomach twisted into a knot so tight she thought she might be sick. She discovered that shame has a taste. It tastes like copper and dust. She had walked for 2 days to get to this town, her shoes worn to paper, all for the hope of a job that would keep the hunger away. Her husband had died last winter, leaving her with nothing but debts and a name the town was trying to forget. And that was the problem. You see, her husband hadn't just died. He'd been found at the bottom of a ravine with his neck broken. And folks in these parts had long memories. They didn't like mysteries. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer tried again, a sharp edge of desperation in his voice. "Someone here needs a woman who can keep a house." A ripple of cruel laughter went through the crowd. One man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. An old woman up front muttered just loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's the Harlan woman, the one whose husband went and got himself killed." "Brings trouble wherever she goes," another voice added. "Bad luck, that one." Millie's fingers tightened on her shawl until her knuckles were white bone. She forced her chin up, just for a second, to prove to herself she wasn't completely broken yet. That's when she saw him. A man leaning against a wagon at the edge of the crowd. He was tall and broad, a dark shadow of a man. 2 small children clung to his legs like he was the only tree in a storm. Eli Carter hadn't planned on being there. He'd come to town for flour and rope, and maybe, just maybe, a pair of hands to help around his ranch. Since Mary died, the house had gone as quiet as a grave. The fields were harder to work alone. And his children, Ben and Annie, were getting used to going to bed with their bellies half empty. He told himself it was just business, a simple transaction. He needed help, and these women needed work. Nothing more. but he heard the whispers about Millie. He knew about her husband. Everyone did. And he, more than anyone, knew what it was like to be judged by the ghosts that follow you. The auctioneer's patience finally snapped. Last chance, folks. You'll not find a cheaper soul in the whole territory. The silence was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Then, a tiny hand tugged on Eli's coat. It was his daughter, Annie. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice a tiny bird in the big, mean square. "That lady looks scared." Eli looked down at his daughter's worried face, then back at the woman on the platform. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was trying to make herself small enough to disappear. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition. He was looking at someone standing in the same dark, lonely place he'd been in for months. He raised a single finger. $1, he said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a gunshot. The crowd gasped. Women covered their mouths. Men turned to stare at him like he'd just grown a second head. Why would the quietest man in the county bid on the most troubled woman? "Sold!" the auctioneer shouted, relieved to be done with it. Millie bowed her head, feeling like mercy was just another kind of shame. As the crowd broke up, Eli led his children to his wagon. Millie followed a few steps behind, a ghost in broad daylight. The sheriff handed Eli a slip of paper, a proof of hire, they called it. It felt like a bill of sale. The sheriff gave Millie a long, hard look. It wasn't kind. It was suspicious. "Good luck, ma'am," he said, but his voice was cold. "Try and stay out of trouble this time." She just nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The ride home was long and silent. Millie sat in the back of the wagon, her hands clenched in her lap. The children kept stealing glances at her, whispering to each other. Eli just stared at the trail ahead, his jaw set like stone. She'd learned long ago that the safest way to be was small and quiet. Finally, she couldn't take the silence anymore. Her voice was cracked from thirst and fear. "Thank you for taking me on, sir." Eli didn't turn around. "Just need help at the house," he said, his words flat and hard. "That's all this is." She nodded, accepting the terms. She had no idea that this silent man was not what he seemed. He had a past of his own, a temper that had once been the talk of the county. He'd buried it along with his wife, but it was still there, sleeping just beneath the surface. And she couldn't possibly know that in 6 months she'd be backed against a barn wall, begging him not to hurt her, and that those words would change everything. All she knew was that she'd been bought for $1, and whatever came next, she would have to survive it. The first week at the Carter Ranch was like walking on a floor covered in broken glass. Millie worked from before the sun came up until long after it went down. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She mended clothes that weren't torn. She cooked meals with hands that trembled every time she heard his heavy footsteps. Her first husband had taught her that being busy was being safe. If you were useful, maybe you were too valuable to hit. Eli was a ghost in his own home. He'd leave food on the table for her, a biscuit, an apple, without a word. She'd stare at it, certain it was a trap. Men didn't give things without expecting something in return, usually something that left bruises you couldn't see. When he would nod in approval of her cooking, she would freeze, sure that it was a trick, that he was just waiting for the right moment to unleash his anger about some mistake she didn't even know she'd made. She flinched every time he walked into a room. She jumped when he reached past her for the coffee pot. She kept her eyes down, her voice a whisper, and her body always angled toward the nearest exit, just in case. Even little Annie noticed. "Why do you jump when Papa walks in?" she asked one morning. Millie's hands stopped moving in the dishwater. "I don't mean to, sweetheart," she said softly. "Just startled is all." But it wasn't about being startled. It was about knowing a man's mood could turn like the weather. Sunny one minute, a thunderstorm the next. And the only way to survive the storm was to see the clouds gathering before the lightning struck. One day, Eli rode into town for supplies. In the general store, he saw a dress. It was plain blue cotton, simple and sturdy. But it was new. It was clean. He bought it, telling himself it was practical. Her own dress was practically rags. But that wasn't the whole truth. He bought it because it was the same color as his late wife Mary's eyes. When Millie found the dress folded at the bottom of the flour sack that evening, her blood ran cold. Why would he buy her a dress? And not just any dress, but one that was clearly expensive. What did he want from her? Her first husband had given her a ribbon once, a pretty silk ribbon. Later that night, he'd used it to tie her hands. She tried to give it back the next morning, holding it out to him with her eyes fixed on the floor. "I can't accept this, sir." His voice came out harder than he meant it to, full of a frustration she couldn't understand. "It's just a dress, woman. You need one that ain't falling apart." She went pale, mistaking his frustration for rage. She backed away as if he'd already raised his hand. "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." That night, she wore it to supper. Not because she wanted to, but because she was terrified of what would happen if she didn't. Eli looked up from his plate, and for a second, his face softened. A small, sad smile touched his lips. He was remembering Mary. But Millie didn't see a grieving husband. She saw a man looking at her in a new way. A way that made her feel like a fly caught in a spider's web. She froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, her mind racing. What did that smile mean? What would it cost her? The children felt the tension. It was a cold, sharp thing at the dinner table. Ben, the older boy, silently reached under the table and squeezed his little sister's hand. Later, in her small room, Millie laid the blue dress across her bed. It looked like something beautiful and dangerous, something holy and something cursed. She didn't know that the dress had belonged to a ghost. She didn't know she was wearing a dead woman's memory. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. A real storm was coming, and it was about to force them both to face the ghosts that lived between them. The storm hit just after midnight, a full-throated roar of thunder and rain. The walls of the small cabin shook, and the windows rattled like they were about to shatter. Millie woke with a jolt, her heart already hammering against her ribs. Storms meant angry weather, and angry weather made angry men. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way. Then she heard it. A child's scream, sharp with terror. She was out of bed in an instant, grabbing a blanket and running to the children's room. Little Annie was sitting bolt upright in her bed, her face streaked with tears, her small body shaking with every crash of thunder. "It's all right, sweetheart," Millie whispered, pulling the little girl into her arms. "It's just the wind and the rain. It can't hurt you in here." She started to hum an old lullaby, a tune her own mother had sung to her. The soft melody was a fragile thread against the roaring storm. Annie's sobs slowly quieted, and her little fingers clutched at Millie's nightgown like she was the only safe thing in the whole world. For the first time since she'd arrived, Millie felt a sense of rightness. This was what she was meant for. Not just surviving, but comforting, being needed. She didn't hear Eli come to the doorway. She didn't know he was standing there, watching. He saw her sitting on his daughter's bed, a soft silhouette in the flashes of lightning. He saw the way Annie clung to her. He heard the gentle lullaby. And for a moment, the silence in his own heart felt a little less empty. He took a step into the room, meaning to thank her, meaning to check on his daughter. But all Millie saw was a large man moving toward her in the dark. Every instinct screamed. Every scar, old and new, burned. She recoiled, her arms flying up to shield her face, her body going rigid with a terror so pure it was almost silent. The world seemed to stop. The thunder faded. Eli froze. He had seen fear in her eyes before, but never like this. Never aimed at him. It was raw and absolute. And in that sickening moment, he finally understood. She wasn't just shy. She wasn't just nervous. She was terrified of him. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice a raw whisper. Her arms stayed up. "Everyone says that," she breathed, the words cracking. The words hit him like a physical blow. He looked past her and saw his son, Ben, standing in the doorway, his young face a mask of confusion and fear. Eli took a slow, deliberate step backward, holding his hands out where she could see them. I'll just leave you be," he stammered. "You're doing good with her." He turned and walked out, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He stood on the porch, letting the storm soak him to the bone. He gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. He thought his silence was just grief, a way to honor Mary. But standing there in the rain, he realized his silence had become a wall. A high, cold wall that made him look like a monster to a woman who had already known too many of them. Inside, Millie held Annie until the little girl fell back asleep. But her mind was a whirlwind. He had backed away. When she showed fear, he had left. Men didn't do that. In her world, fear was an invitation. It was a challenge. You showed fear, and they showed you why you were right to be afraid. But he had just left. The next morning, the world was gray and quiet. The storm had passed, and something inside the cabin had broken too. Eli moved differently now. He knocked on doors. He announced himself before entering a room. "Coming in for coffee," he'd say, his voice softer, more careful. He was trying to learn a new language, the language of safety. Millie watched him, confused. This silent, brooding man who had bought her for $1, who wore a dead woman's memory in his eyes, was actively trying to be less frightening. She didn't know if she could trust it. But deep inside, a tiny, fragile seed of something new was beginning to sprout. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was the possibility of trust. A green shoot reaching for the light in a world that had been dark for a very, very long time. And she had no idea that this fragile new beginning was about to be tested by a new danger, one far worse than a storm. 3 weeks later, everything changed. Eli was by the corral, mending a fence. The bay mare, usually a calm animal, spooked. A snake, maybe. A shadow. She reared up, hooves like lightning, and her back leg caught the fence rail Eli was leaning on. The sound was sickening, a crack of splintering wood mixed with the wet snap of bone. Eli went down. Hard. Millie came running from the cabin and saw his arm twisted at an angle that wasn't natural, an angle that meant trouble. In that instant, the fear that had been her constant companion vanished. This was something she understood. Her first marriage had been a long, brutal education in tending to injuries. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice clear and steady. She dropped to her knees beside him, already tearing a strip from her apron. "Ben, run and get clean cloths. Annie, the whiskey from the high shelf." Eli, his face gray with pain, watched her. He saw a different woman. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely competence. Her hands were sure and quick as she splinted his arm. For the next week, she was the one in charge. She tended to him, fed the children, and ran the ranch. She expected the pain to make him mean. That's what pain did to men. It gave them an excuse to lash out. But Eli wasn't like other men. He didn't yell when changing the bandages hurt. He didn't curse or blame. He just watched her with his quiet, haunted eyes and whispered, "Thank you." One night, after the children were asleep, she sat in the chair by his bed. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was becoming a bridge. "Can I ask you something?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you so quiet all the time?" He stared at the ceiling for a long time. "Lost my wife," he finally said. "Childbirth. Lost the baby, too. After that, words felt empty, so I stopped using them." "I'm sorry," she said. He turned his head to look at her. "Can I ask you something now?" She tensed, but nodded. "Your husband. He's the one who hurt you, isn't he?" The room felt small, airless. "Yes," she whispered. "Regular." A flash of pure, cold rage crossed Eli's face. Millie saw it and went rigid, her chair scraping back as she started to flee. "Wait," he said quickly. "I'm not angry at you. I'm angry for you. There's a difference." She stood frozen, not understanding. "A man who'd raise his hand to a woman ain't a man at all," Eli said, his voice hard as iron. "What he did to you was wrong. You know that, right?" Tears she didn't know were there spilled down her cheeks. No one had ever said that to her before. Everyone had always acted like it was her fault, like she deserved it. "I don't know what I know anymore," she cried. As Eli's arm mended, the seasons began to change. So did the feeling in the little cabin. Millie was no longer just the hired woman. Eli was no longer just the silent cowboy. The children, who had been quiet as mice, started to laugh again. The house began to feel like a home. One evening, Eli watched Millie laughing at something Ben said. Her whole face lit up, and a feeling hit him with the force of a physical blow, a feeling that scared him more than the horse accident ever had. He was falling in love with her. He was about to tell her, to try and find the words he'd buried so long ago. But he never got the chance, because that's when he heard the hoofbeats. It was Sheriff Cole Maddox, and he wasn't there for a friendly visit. "Evening, Carter," the sheriff said, dismounting. His face was grim. "Got some news. Bad news." They stood in the yard, away from the cabin. "A man came through town asking about Millie Harland," the sheriff said, turning his hat over in his hands. "Says his name is Jake Harland, her husband's brother." Eli's blood went cold. "He's claiming she stole from the family when she left," the sheriff continued. "But that's not the worst of it, Eli. He's telling anyone who'll listen that she's the one who killed his brother, pushed him into that ravine." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. It wasn't about a debt. It was a murder accusation. "That's a lie," Eli said, his voice low. "Maybe," the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. "But Jake's got away with words. He's stirring up trouble. Says he's coming to collect her, to take her back for justice." "When?" "Day or two, I'd reckon. Just wanted to warn you. Between you and me, Jake Harland is a mean piece of work. Meaner than his brother ever was." The sheriff mounted his horse. "The law's a funny thing out here, Eli. A woman's word against a man's. It doesn't count for much. Be careful." After the sheriff was gone, Eli stood in the yard, the setting sun casting a long, lonely shadow. He had just started to let the light back into his life. And now, a new darkness was coming for them. Eli found Millie in the kitchen, kneading bread dough. She saw his face, and her hands went still. "What is it?" "Your husband's brother," Eli said, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "He's coming for you. He's telling people that you killed your husband." The bowl slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. Flour bloomed into the air like a white cloud of disaster. "No," she whispered, her face as white as the flour on the floor. "No, he can't. That's not what happened." "Pack your things," Eli said, his voice rough. "I'll give you money. You need to run. Get somewhere safe." "I'm not going anywhere," she said, backing away, her old fear returning like a flood. "I won't bring this trouble on you. On your children. I'll be gone by morning." She turned and ran, not to her room, but out toward the barn. Eli followed her, catching her arm gently just inside the door. She spun around, her eyes wild with terror. "Let me go," she pleaded. "Please. You don't know Jake. He's a monster. He'll hurt you to get to me." "I won't let anyone take you," Eli said, his voice shaking with an emotion he could no longer keep buried. "Why?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "Why would you fight for me? I'm nothing. I'm just the woman you bought for $1. "You are not nothing," he roared, and the sound echoed in the quiet barn. "You brought this house back to life. You made my children laugh again. You made me feel again." He took a shaky breath. "I love you, Millie. I'm not letting anyone hurt you. Not ever again." Before she could process his words, they heard it. The sound of a horse ridden hard, and a man's voice, slurred with whiskey and rage, shouting her name. "Millie Harland! I know you're in there, you murderer!" Jake Harland was already striding toward the barn. He was bigger than Eli, thick and brutal, with the dead, merciless eyes of a predator. He shoved past Eli as if he wasn't even there and cornered Millie against the back wall. The lantern light caught the ugly sneer on his face. "There you are, girl," Jake snarled, his breath a foul wave of liquor. "Thought you could run from what you did. You're coming with me. You're going to pay." He raised his hand. It was happening again. The same shadows, the same fear, the same looming violence. Millie pressed herself against the rough wood, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she whispered, the words a broken prayer. Please don't beat me." Time stopped. In that instant, Eli Carter saw it all. Every moment of fear she'd ever lived. Every unheard plea. Every bruise, seen and unseen. And the silence he had lived in for so long finally broke. It shattered into a million pieces, and what came out was thunder. "Touch her," Eli said, his voice as cold and deadly as a winter night. "And you'll answer to me." Jake turned slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "This ain't your business, Carter. This is family." He looked back at Millie, his eyes full of a terrifying possessiveness. "And she's family property. She's going to be my wife," Eli said, the words an oath sworn in the dusty barn. Jake let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "Wife? You can't marry a murderer. She killed my brother, pushed him. I saw it." A gasp escaped Millie's lips. "That's a lie. He fell. He was drunk and he slipped." "Your word against mine," Jake sneered. "And who's the town gonna believe?" He lunged for Millie, but Eli was faster. He stepped between them, a solid wall of quiet fury. "You have two choices," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "You can walk away now, or the sheriff can drag you away in chains." "The sheriff?" Jake laughed again. "The sheriff works for me. He knows who really runs things in this county." And as if summoned by the devil himself, Sheriff Maddox appeared in the barn doorway. But he wasn't looking at Jake. He was looking at Millie, and his hand was resting on the butt of his gun. "Millie Harland," the sheriff said, his voice flat and official. "You're under arrest for the murder of your husband." The world spun out from under Millie. The sheriff wasn't here to save her. He was here to condemn her. Jake's sneering face swam in her vision. It was a trap. It had always been a trap. "No," Eli said, his voice a low growl. He didn't move from his spot in front of Millie. "You're not taking her." "Step aside, Carter," the sheriff warned, his hand now gripping his pistol. "This is official business. We have a witness." "A witness who's a liar and a drunk," Eli shot back. "You know Jake Harland is no good." "Don't matter what I know," the sheriff said, his eyes cold. "It's what he says he saw. Now move." Jake's smile was triumphant. He had won. He reached around Eli, his dirty hand grabbing for Millie's arm. "It's true," a small voice said from the shadows. Everyone froze. Eli's son, Ben, stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales. His face was pale, but his eyes were determined. Annie was hiding behind him, peering out. "Ben, get back in the house," Eli ordered. "No, Pa," the boy said, his voice shaking but clear. "I have to tell. It's true what he said. I saw it too." The air left Millie's lungs. Betrayal, sharp and cold, pierced her heart. The boy. Ben was lying. But why? Jake's grin widened. "See? Even the boy knows. The whole family saw what she did." "No," Ben said, stepping further into the light. "Not that. I saw something else. Weeks ago. I saw Mr. Harland meeting with the sheriff right here. They were arguing. Mr. Harland was yelling. About a woman." The sheriff's face went stiff. The boy's confused. "I'm not confused," Ben insisted, his courage growing. "Mr. Harland said the sheriff was seeing his wife, my ma. He said everyone knew it." A stunned silence fell over the barn. Eli stared at the sheriff, a dawning, terrible understanding on his face. Mary. His Mary. With the sheriff? "He said Ma was going to leave you for him," Ben whispered, his eyes filling with tears. "And then?" "Then Mr. Harland threatened him. Said he'd tell everyone. Said he'd ruin him." The sheriff took a step forward. "That's enough, boy." "And I found this," Ben said, pulling something from his pocket. It was a small, silver locket. "It was Ma's. I found it out by the ravine, the day after they found Mr. Harland's body." Eli recognized it instantly. It was the locket he'd given Mary on their wedding day. The truth hit Eli like a physical blow. It wasn't Millie's husband who fell. He was pushed. But not by Millie. "You killed him," Eli said, his voice a dead whisper, looking at the sheriff. "You killed him to keep him quiet about you and my wife." The sheriff's face crumbled. The lie was broken. He was scum, Eli. He was going to destroy everything. It was an accident. And you let Millie take the blame, Eli continued, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. You and Jake cooked this up. He gets her. You get to bury your secret. Jake saw the game was up. He lunged, not for Millie, but for the sheriff, pulling a knife from his boot. You ain't pinning this on me. But Eli was a man unleashed. The silent, grieving cowboy was gone. In his place was a husband and a father defending his home. He moved with a speed and fury no one knew he possessed. He hit Jake once, a hard, clean blow that sent the bigger man sprawling into the dirt, out cold. The sheriff stood frozen, his gun hanging uselessly at his side. He was a broken man, his sins exposed by a child in a dusty barn. The barn was quiet except for the sound of Millie's ragged breathing. It was over. The lies, the fear, the ghosts of 2 dead men, all of it laid bare in the lantern light. Eli turned to her, his face a mixture of grief, rage, and a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. He looked at the locket in his son's hand, the proof of his wife's betrayal. Then he looked at Millie, the woman who had been blamed for it all. He took a slow step toward her, his movements careful, gentle. He's gone, Eli said, his voice rough with emotion. The sheriff would be taken care of. The lies were finished. Millie just nodded, still pressed against the wall, her eyes wide with shock. She looked from the unconscious form of Jake Harlan to the defeated sheriff, and finally to Eli. What I said, Eli started, his voice cracking, about you being my wife. I meant it. More now than ever. She shook her head, fresh tears tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. You don't have to. After what you just found out about your wife. This isn't about owing anyone anything, he said, stopping a few feet from her, giving her space. My past, it's a mess. Full of secrets I didn't even know were there, and your past, it's full of pain you didn't deserve. He ran a hand through his hair, the words still new and clumsy in his mouth. Maybe 2 broken people can build something whole, not on top of the old life, but something new. Together. But only if you want that. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you. I'm asking because when the whole world was falling apart just now, the only thing I could think about was keeping you safe. Millie's breath hitched. I don't know how to not be afraid, she whispered. I know, he said softly, but you don't have to figure it out by yourself anymore. He held out his hand, palm up. An invitation, a promise. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw the pain there, the fresh wound of his wife's betrayal. But she also saw strength. She saw gentleness. She saw a man who had stepped between her and a monster, between her and a corrupt lawman, without a moment's hesitation. Slowly, she took a breath that felt like the first real breath of her life, and she put her hand in his. The next morning, the preacher came. They stood under the big cottonwood tree, the same one Mary was buried near. But it didn't feel like a place of ghosts anymore. It felt like a place of new beginnings. Ben and Annie stood beside them, their faces shining. Millie wore the blue dress, but it wasn't a dead woman's dress anymore. It was her own. When the preacher asked them to say their vows, Eli spoke from the heart. I promise to honor you, he said, his voice steady. To protect you, and to make sure you always have a voice in this house. Your safety will matter more to me than anything. Millie's voice was soft, but strong. I promise to trust you, even when the fear tells me not to. I promise to build a home with you, and I promise to be brave. The preacher pronounced them husband and wife. And when Eli kissed her, she didn't flinch. She kissed him back. That night, she was nervous. Old habits die hard. But Eli understood. He slept in the chair by the window. We've got all the time in the world, Millie, he said. There's no rush for anything you're not ready for. She fell asleep to the sight of him watching over her, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely, truly safe. 6 months passed. Autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and red. The laughter of the children filled the air. Millie moved with a new confidence, the shadows gone from her eyes. One evening, as they sat on the porch, she took Eli's hand and placed it on her belly. A small, gentle curve was beginning to show. His eyes went wide. "Are you—" She smiled, her eyes wet with happy tears. "Come spring." He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Two broken people who had found each other in the wreckage of their lives. Two survivors who were learning not just to live, but to love. She had been sold for $1, a woman burdened by lies and fear. He had been a man entombed in silence, haunted by a ghost who was not what she seemed. But that day in the barn, when she whispered, "Please don't beat me," something shifted. A silent man found his voice. A terrified woman found her courage. She learned that safety isn't just the absence of pain, but the presence of kindness. He learned that true strength isn't found in silence, but in the courage to speak up for what is right. Together, they built a new story. A home where fear had no place, and love was a choice they made every single day. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption from the Old West.